Welcome to the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show on the RevCom's YouTube channel. This is episode 8 on May 14th, 2020. To all of our first-time viewers, welcome to the Revolution. You are in the right spot, a show like no other where we bring you revolution and why nothing else and nothing less than an actual revolution can free humanity. This is a show about the world and for a radically new world. A show where we dig into the outrageous, unnecessary crimes that this system rains down on the people here and around the world. We bring to you the potential of masses of people all over the world to work together to solve problems, to discover, to cooperate, and to create beauty. Potential that is thwarted, twisted, stifled, suppressed, and repressed, with millions of lives unnecessarily ground up by this capitalist imperialist system, where children's and grown-up spirits are crushed by the same dog-eat-dog system. This is a system you will learn more about as you stay with us over this episode and the coming episodes. And you need to follow and go where it leads you. And I want to welcome, too, our returning audience. Revolutionary greetings to all of you who have experienced and are coming back to learn more and to get into what the RNL show brings, that no other show does, that there is a way out of this madness to a radically different and far better future through an actual revolution to overthrow the killing machine that is capitalism, imperialism, and how we can prepare for the time when it becomes possible to lead millions of people to go all out and win, defeating those who enforce this system, and going forward to dismantling all the outmoded and oppressive institutions and build a new society where we could work together to overcome all forms of oppression. At the RNL show, we will struggle with you not to think the way the system tells you to, and we invite you to be a part of the revolution as you learn more about it. And you need to go every day to the website revcom.us to get that revolutionary sustenance. We come to you with the conviction that there is a way to know and change the world, that people can change, that a better world is possible. But where does our fortitude and the confidence that this is possible come from? It comes from Bob Avakian, a totally different type of political leader, a revolutionary leader who came out of the 1960s and throughout the decades since has been leading and developing a movement for an actual revolution, and who has never stopped learning from the past revolutions as well as the broad experience of people around the world to develop this way out of the madness that has resulted in the new synthesis of communism, which we call the new communism. This is a game-changing breakthrough in how to know and change the world. BA has put the science of revolution and the science of communism on a consistently scientific basis. What does this mean? Well, it means everything. If humanity can understand the world as it actually is, why things happen the way they do, what are their root causes, then we are on the road to being scientific. And you are on the road to finding a cure. And this applies to disease, a crucial matter today when we face the COVID pandemic. And it applies to society, to cure the plague of capitalism, imperialism, which now may have brought humanity to the brink of a situation where the system may destroy life itself through its ruination of the environment, if it doesn't destroy it first through nuclear war. All of this heightened with the rise of the Trump-Pence fascist regime. Last week on this show, episode 7, we showed some incredible film and spoke about the 1960s in this country, in particular the anniversary of the Kent and Jackson State massacres of students, the shootings of students by the National Guard and the Highway Patrol. Students who were protesting the unjust and immoral and outrageous war against the Vietnamese people. And I want to say that you should watch this show if you haven't. You should tell your friends to watch it, and if you watched it once, watch it again. It was very rich discussion. There was an important segment there from Bob Avakian, which people should really get into. But questions were posed in this episode. Can people change? How do they change? How can people change from just going along with the flow to being committed to changing the world? So here, let me direct you again and recommend to you the story of Bob Avakian's own life as he tells it in his memoir, From Ike to Mao and Beyond, My Journey from Mainstream America to Being a Revolutionary Communist. Right there in the title, you have it, from a supporter of Ike, Eisenhower, the president of the U.S. in the 1950s, a former general, a conservative, And the whole times were this way. If you've ever watched the show Mad Men, you get a picture of one side of it. But actually, in the 50s and then into the early 60s, there was another story that was happening at the same time. There were struggles brewing and taking place among oppressed people around the world and here in the US among black people for civil rights. Which brings me to the subject of today's show, to the goddamn outrage of what this system does to black people and has done since this country was founded. Last week, there were several incidents of police murder of black people across the country. And on top of that, it is now indisputable that black and Latino people are being disproportionately taken seriously ill and dying of the coronavirus, and that the Trump fascist regime knew this and suppressed information about it, costing lives. But more, the pre-existing conditions of white supremacy and capitalism contributed mightily to this situation, from the prisons to the detention camps where black and Latino masses are kept packed together in unhealthy situations in the best of times and deadly in this time, to the inner cities and the poor black and suburban and ex-urban and rural communities where proximity to pollution and to pollutants has poisoned the air and compromised the lungs of black and Latino people, including very young children. And piling outrage on top of outrage, it comes to light that the police across the country are arresting black people who don't socially distance, while distributing masks and maybe issuing a summons to white people who also don't socially distance. And then there was the release of the video of the hunting, then the lynching by shotgun of a young black man, Ahmaud Arbery, out for a jog in this time of COVID pandemic in his hometown in Georgia last February. The coldness of this wanton murder seared deep into the psyche of black people and should shake the conscience of everyone. Today's whole episode is dedicated to all of this. And we begin and frame our episode with the words of Bob Avakian.
There is the potential for something of unprecedented beauty to arise out of unspeakable ugliness. Black people playing a crucial role in putting an end, at long last, to this system which has, for so long, not just exploited, but dehumanized, terrorized, and tormented them in 1,000 ways. Putting an end to this in the only way it can be done, by fighting to emancipate humanity, to put an end to the long night in which human society has been divided into masters and slaves, and the masses of humanity have been lashed, beaten, raped, slaughtered, shackled, and shrouded in ignorance and misery.
In elementary school, Ahmaud Arbery was the funniest kid on the bus, according to his lifelong best friend. He was someone who had effortless charm. In high school, he was a standout football player, often the fastest on the field. And after high school, he continued to run. Ahmaud, or Maud as he was known by his friends, loved to run. A former high school classmate, Lauren Bennett, described seeing him frequently running through the neighborhoods and waving at him, impressed by his discipline. I always thought he was training for something, she said. But on February 23rd of this year, Maud was out for a run and just 2 miles from his house when he was set upon by 2 white men, racist vigilantes who saw him running past their house and put it in their minds that this young black man must be a criminal, was somebody that they had to take it upon themselves to hunt down and bring to justice. So they got their shotguns and they got in their pickup trucks and they chased Ahmaud. From their own statements given to police, they tried to cut him off and Ahmaud ran away. So they chased him some more in their pickup trucks. And they got out of the truck, the son got out of the truck and confronted Ahmaud. 3 shots were fired and Ahmaud Arbery lay dying in the street. We know this because there was cell phone footage that shows this brutal murder, this lynching, that smacks of the days of slave hunters, white people taking it upon themselves to hunt down a free black man. and bring him to justice. So the police arrive on the scene, and despite there being a man who is bleeding out, a black man bleeding out, whose life is leaking from him into the street, and two white men, one of whom has his blood on his hands, the police do not make an arrest. They send these two white men home, to quote Ahmaud's mother, to sleep in the safety of their own beds, to walk free, even as Ahmaud Arbery was sent into the ground permanently. This is America. This cuts to the quick of what this country is and always has been. A white supremacist country from its soil and its roots to today.
But what if the world doesn't have to be this way? What if we could live in a world where never again would a parent have to fear for the life of their child just because of the color of their skin? What if we lived in a world where never again would that soul-wrenching experience that never leaves of having to bury your own child whose life was stolen by a brutal thug with a gun and the backing of the powers that be? What if being black no longer meant living in a white supremacist society that continually assaults you in your very being and very sense of worth, constantly subjects you to terror, openly or in more subtle ways, and forces you to face the constant danger that you or your children will have your life snuffed out at any moment for doing nothing but being.
To get into why achieving this requires an actual revolution, and to point towards how we can make that revolution, we're going to go to the speech Bob Avakian gave in 2018 called Why We Need an Actual Revolution and How We Can Really Make Revolution, an excerpt where he talks about the oppression of black people and how it is woven into this system.
In 2012, in Revolution Nothing Less, I talked about the outrageous murder of Ramarley Graham earlier that same year, shot down in his own house in the Bronx by the New York City police. He was only 18 years old. Do I have to tell you what race he was? His mother kept saying, "This has to stop." And his father repeated over and over, "Why did they kill my son? Why did they kill my son?" New York cops then loudly rallied around their fellow pig who murdered Ramarley in cold blood, viciously taunting Ramarley's family and loved ones, demonstrating yet one more time the ugly truth that in the way this country has been built, and for the powers that be in this country, the humanity of black people has never counted for anything. They have never been valued as human beings, but only as things to be exploited, oppressed, and repressed. 6 years later, and with cold-blooded murders by police, continuing in an unbroken chain, I will say again now what I said then. How many more times does this have to happen? How many more times do the tears and the cries of anguish and anger have to pour forth from the wounded hearts of people? How many more times, when another of these outrageous murders is perpetrated by the police, do we have to hear those words that pour gasoline on the already burning wounds? Justifiable homicide, justified use of force by police. How many more? Ramarley Graham, Nicholas Hayward Jr., Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Darius Pinex, Oscar Grant, Manuel Diaz, Joel Acevedo, Laquan McDonald, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Sandra Bland, Jack Sun, Rennie Davis, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Maurice Granton, Harith Augustus. The list goes on and on and on. Thousands and thousands, especially Black and Latino and Native American. If this were the only thing wrong with this system, it would be more than enough reason to sweep it off the earth. But this is only part of the intolerable outrages that are continually perpetrated by this system and that cause so much unnecessary suffering for the masses of humanity. So let's go back to why and what it will take to make all the outrages really stop. Why are Black people, Latinos, and Native Americans subjected to genocidal persecution, mass incarceration, police brutality, and murder? Why is there the patriarchal degradation, dehumanization, and subjugation of all women everywhere, and oppression based on gender or sexual orientation? Why are there wars of empire, armies of occupation, and crimes against humanity? Why is there the demonization, criminalization, and deportations of immigrants and the militarization of the border? Why is the environment of our planet being destroyed? These are what we call the 5 stops, deep and defining contradictions of this system, with all the destruction and suffering they cause, which must be protested and resisted in a powerful way, with a real determination to stop them, but which can only be finally ended by putting an end to this system itself. Why, along with all this, do we live in a world where large parts of humanity live in stark poverty, with 2.3 billion people lacking even rudimentary toilets or latrines, and huge numbers suffering from preventable diseases, with millions of children dying every year from these diseases and from starvation, while 150 million children in the world are forced to engage in ruthlessly exploited child labor. And the whole world economy rests on a vast network of sweatshops, employing large numbers of women who are regularly subjected to sexual harassment and assault. A world where 65 million refugees have been displaced by war, poverty, persecution, and the effects of global warming. Why is this the state of humanity? There is one fundamental reason. The basic nature of the system of capitalism, imperialism that we live under, and the way, because of its very nature, it continually perpetrates and perpetuates horror after horror. And in fundamental terms, we have 2 choices. Either live with all this and condemn future generations to the same, or worse, if they have a future at all, or make revolution. But what is the scientific basis for saying that this system is the source of all this? That it is built into this system, and therefore it is impossible to do away with these outrages through reforming this system, and instead it must be overthrown. Let's go back to those 5 stops. The oppression of black people and other people of color. This system in this country was founded in genocide and slavery. From the beginning, African Americans and Native Americans were treated as pariahs, a caste of people less than human and not deserving of the same rights and opportunities as the European settlers of the territory. White supremacy was poured into the foundation and into every institution of the country. The uniting of the United States was accomplished through the compromise written into the founding Constitution that institutionalized slavery. And for generations, slave labor produced a great part of the wealth of this country. As I said in Basics 1:1, there would be no United States as we now know it today without slavery. That is a simple and basic truth. And then, when it was no longer possible to contain the conflicts that had been somewhat held in check by the founding compromise, the Civil War erupted between the southern slave states and the northern states, which increasingly were based on the exploitation of wage labor by capitalists. But shortly after the end of this Civil War, another compromise was engineered, which was a continuation of the original compromise under the new conditions. The country was put back together on the basis of reaffirming and reinforcing white supremacy, with the masses of black people still overwhelmingly in the South, subjugated and terrorized into second-class citizen status, exploited in conditions of near slavery and sometimes still literal slavery by white plantation and other property owners. And the land and way of life of the native peoples was further stolen through armed conquest and decimated by slaughter, confinement in reservations, and cultural genocide, which has resulted in the poverty, oppression, and repression that continues to be inflicted on Native Americans to this day. Under slavery, it was the armed patrols and militias, organized by the slave owners, that hunted down slaves who rebelled or just tried to escape, and terrorized the masses of black people as a whole. After slavery, with Jim Crow segregation, it was the Ku Klux Klan, together with local sheriffs, who largely played this role. Today, in the conditions in which masses of black people in the ghettos of the inner cities find themselves, the role that was played in the past by the slave patrols and then the Ku Klux Klan and local sheriffs is now carried out by heavily armed urban police forces. This is a big part of the overall role of the police, which, as I said in Basics 124, is not to serve and protect the people. It is to serve and protect the system that rules over the people, to enforce the relations of exploitation and oppression, the conditions of poverty, misery, and degradation into which the system has cast people and is determined to keep people in. The law and order the police are about, with all their brutality and murder, is the law and order that enforces all this oppression and madness. In the days of slavery and then Jim Crow segregation after the Civil War, the oppressors viciously exploited and terrorized black people, brutally murdering those they saw as posing a threat or not staying in their place. But they did not kill off or incarcerate a huge part of the black population because their labor was needed as a backbone and crucial source of profit for the cotton plantations and the overall economy in the South and the country as a whole. Today, with great numbers of black people concentrated in the inner cities, and with many factories and other capitalist enterprises having moved away from the urban cores, the police have killed thousands of black people in the last few decades, and they play a key part in forcibly maintaining masses of black people in a situation where, especially youth, robbed of any decent future under this system, are killing each other in the thousands, and millions are either incarcerated or in some other way under the control of the so-called justice system. Because white supremacy is such a defining part of this country, it is not just African Americans and Native Americans, but people of color generally who are subjected to discrimination, degradation, and brutality. And this applies now in acute ways to those whose roots lie in Mexico, El Salvador, and other parts of Central America and the Caribbean, which are tightly ensnared in a net of domination and exploitation by the imperialists of the USA, whose ravaging of these countries has driven many to emigrate to the US itself. White supremacy and capitalism, they have been completely interwoven and tightly stitched together through the whole development of this country down to today. To attempt to really put an end to white supremacy while maintaining the system of capitalism would tear the entire fabric of the country apart. White supremacy and capitalism. It is not possible to overcome and finally abolish the one without overthrowing and finally abolishing the other.
So that was Bob Avakian from Why We Need an Actual Revolution and How We Could Really Make a Revolution. That was the beginning segment from that film. I'm really excited that on Skype today I have Carl Dix here. Carl is a friend, a colleague, a comrade. Carl has been a revolutionary for decades. During the Vietnam War as a GI, he refused to go to Vietnam and served time in Leavenworth, and after getting out, he became involved in the movement even further, and he had the opportunity of meeting Bob Avakian, and that took him on the journey to being a revolutionary communist, and that's a journey that we've both been on. It's a never-ending journey as the world is constantly changing, and the science of revolution and of communism has been developed by Bob Avakian and continues to develop. So Carl, welcome to the Revolution Nothing Less show, the RNL show.
Thanks for having me on, Andy.
Okay, so we just heard Bob Avakian, and it was very moving. I'm not going to recap everything he just said, but he starts off with Ramarley Graham's father saying, "Why did they kill my son?" It's something that just echoes and reverberates right down to this morning and this last week, the last 2 weeks. It continues. And in this time of COVID crisis, it has this underlying contradiction of the oppression of black people and the murder by the police. The mass incarceration is only intensified with the prisons themselves becoming incubators and potential death traps. And it's just a horrific situation. So, but we put this, part of why the impetus to do this show today has to do with the videotape that was released of the wanton murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and this just sears right to the soul. So why don't we just start with this and see where we go, man? What do you?
I mean, it was like a punch to the gut. Two white men get their guns and they go hunting for a black man and chase him down, shoot him, murder him, and then say, oh, this was self-defense. We were apprehending a criminal, and the criminal injustice system spends a few months trying to keep that covered up. And it brought me back to this has been going on for decades and even more than a century, through the lynchings back in the Jim Crow segregation lynch mob terror days, but up to today with the police terror and the mass incarceration. It's heartening that people are stepping out and saying, no more, this has got to stop. Coming out in protest, not just in Georgia, but the Ahmaud Arbery murder has sparked off people acting in different parts of the country. People were in the streets in Indianapolis. And it really poses, how does this really get stopped?
This is, you were mentioning slavery from the beginning, and then there's the Civil War. Look, this Confederacy is in the streets right now. These people are in the streets. Not only in the streets, Carl, but they're going into state houses. There's a state senator, black woman, in Michigan, who had to wear a bulletproof vest to go into the state house. Now, you and I, we're for a whole different system than what happens in the state houses under this system. But this is the Confederacy that's taking shape here. Then you have Marion, the prison in Ohio, where 80% of the people, largely black and Latino, overwhelmingly so, 80% have tested positive for the coronavirus. I think at this point almost a score have died. I'm not sure of the exact number, but the last time I looked it was in the teens. This is a concentration of what has been going on in this country, and then we have this situation, which, I really agree with you. You said punch in the gut, and this will be the last thing. I just want to conclude with this, because when you were mentioning this is like the modern day slave catchers, this is these white vigilantes who feel they can just go out and nab and kill this black man. This is, in the last couple of weeks, it's come to light that in Louisville, Kentucky, the police came without a warrant. White cops don't identify themselves, bang on the door in the middle of the night. A boyfriend and girlfriend, they get up, they're not even dressed. He grabs a gun because he sees a bunch of white thugs at his door. A gunfight ensues, she's shot dead, she's a well-respected EMT, and now he's charged with murder. North Carolina, a group of white men show up at somebody's house, and days go by and terrorize the people. I don't want to take the time to walk through the whole story, but why is there this right to do this? And obviously everybody can say if the racial roles had been reversed, we would have another group of black people dead on the street and we're facing death row or something like that. So I'd just like to get a little bit deeper into this, because people really have to understand this is intrinsic. It's rooted in the system, and it can't be uprooted other than through getting a different system. So we should we'll get more into the why of that, but I just feel this punch in the gut point is very important. And you have a life experience that also echoes this.
I actually wanted to go to that a bit, because part of what intensifies this punch to the gut is that I have lived this. I think back to, grew up in Baltimore, got family on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. We used to go over and visit them every summer. And the Eastern Shore of Maryland was the scene of rebellion in the 60s. H. Rap Brown was down there, Gloria Richardson, and night riding by the Klan. I was going down there in the 50s, and I remember the conditions, no paved roads in the black community. You go downtown, narrow sidewalks, and black people, if they went downtown where white people were expected to step off the sidewalk into the street for them. And, I'm from the big city, Baltimore, relatively big compared to the little towns over there. And I ain't used to that. Now, if it was an older person, of course I'd do that because we were raised to respect our elders, whatever race they were. But then here comes this white kid. I'm about maybe 12 years old. This white kid's coming the other way. I'll be damned if I was going to step off for him. I mean, we the same age. We'll figure this out, but I'm not stepping off. And he comes right up to me and he says, "Are you going to get out of my way?" And he hits me with the N-word right in my face. I'm with my cousin. I'm like, we can take this dude easy. My cousin, who knew the area and knew the norms there, grabs me, pulls me off the sidewalk into the mud because it had rained, and yells excuses about how I didn't know the deal. And that diffuses the thing. I'm hot at him and ready to fight him. And he says, "Yeah, you might have been able to beat that white kid, but what about the Klansmen who would come behind them?" And that was something I didn't know about then. I learned it, though, because I found out he was right. I was, on the edge of getting some night riders coming into looking for the Dixes from Baltimore, and everybody knew everybody there. So it would have been just like that. That was then. And then you look at how different is it? How different is it when you look at what happened to Ahmaud Arbery or some of these other things that you talk about? And then you also have to look at where we are right now, because people, even some people who recognize that white supremacy and capitalism are wrapped together, then go to a thing of, well, that means we need to reform them both. No, because that can't be done. You look at it, when I was coming up, there were factories out there. I worked at one of them for a while after I got back from Leavenworth Military Penitentiary for having, refused to go to Vietnam. I worked in a steel mill. And people could easily get jobs there. In fact, when I got hired, there were a bunch of people who had been fired the year before who were brought back because they needed the workforce. Those factories are gone, and not gone out of some malicious thing against people in the inner cities, but out of capitalism's drive for profit. They have gone around the world looking for labor that they could exploit even more viciously than they were exploiting people here. You're not going to reform them back into existence. And then at the same time, you're going to reform away this white supremacy and this virulent put the black people back in their place stuff. No, you are not. I mean, you were talking about these guys at the State House. I was down in Richmond, Virginia, when they had the so-called gun rights rally that was really a white supremacist rally, 22,000 white supremacists, Confederate flags, and thousands of them with their guns. These people are not going to be reformed out of existence. You're actually talking about a system that, because the future that used to be there for people when I was young to go into these factories and make wages that you could raise a family on are gone, the way it comes at people is through the police terror that we're talking about, is through warehousing people in prison, especially black and brown people. And there's divisions at the top. A section of the people at the top who are running this are also we got to bring our hard rock, reactionary, white supremacist, this woman-hating, immigrant-hating base into the fray. We got to unleash it. And that's what we're seeing with this reopen rallies, these armed thugs at the State House. But it's also whipping up these white mobs that are popping up here and there and going after black people. That is not something that you talk about. You can really talk about. If you really want to do something about it, you're going to reform it. You're going to pass a law. You're going to get a policy in, or you're going to have an election, and that will take care of this. Laws have been passed. Policies have been changed. politicians have been gotten into office. This has gone on. We got to stop this. It is unnecessary suffering, and stopping it is going to take an actual revolution. And we have got some of what we need to make that revolution. We've got the leader for that revolution and the leadership in Bob Avakian and the pathway to human emancipation that he's forged, the new communism. We've got the blueprint for a future revolutionary society in the Constitution that he's authored. We've got a strategic approach to that. What we don't have are the people needed to carry that out, and we're working on that.
I think this was a very important point you were making on the fact that this can't be reformed. And I just want to point people back to that film clip we showed at the beginning where Bob Avakian goes into this, exactly the point you were making about black people being concentrated in the cities, the urban cores, and the capitalist enterprises that were there where you worked in the 1970s are being taken away because of the actual workings of the system itself. In fact, but then this intertwining into the very roots of America, the foundation, and this is something, you know, without getting into a whole theoretical thing here, the government, the state, the republic that people so want to save, the capitalist republic, its foundations and in its very institutions is woven through and rife with white supremacy. You know, this is, a lot of people have been looking at this electoral college. The whole way the thing is set up, you can't reform it. And as you know, you gave plenty of examples around body cams, civilian review boards, black mayors, black police, all this kind of stuff won't change this because the police are there, as Avakian says in this clip, not to serve and protect you, but to serve and protect this system of exploitation and oppression. So I thought you made that point very well. Maybe just one other thing I would want to say is too many people go right up to this point, but will not face the reality, will not look at that reality and draw the obvious or the necessary, it's not necessarily obvious, but the conclusion that if you can't reform this system, if you're going to go say that the system is the problem, then why don't you get rid of the system? So this is something we should be talking about. But I want to move on because we said at the, and we'll come back to some of this in the context of this quotation from Bob Avakian, which we heard him speak at the beginning of this program, and Sansara said at that time that this is going to be the framework for our program. So I just want to read this again, where Bob Avakian says, "There is the potential of something of unprecedented beauty to arise out of unspeakable ugliness. Black people playing a crucial role in putting an end at long last to this system which has, for so long, not just exploited, but dehumanized, terrorized, and tormented them in 1,000 ways. Putting an end to this in the only way it can be done, by fighting to emancipate humanity, to put an end to the long night in which human society has been divided into masters and slaves, and masses of humanity have been lashed, beaten, raped, slaughtered, shackled, and shrouded in ignorance and misery." So I'd like us to get into this. And first off, it's just an incredible juxtaposition of this incredible beauty up against the history of the ugly. There's a lot of poetry and reality that's concentrated in that. The horror of the ugliness of what has been in this country and what still is, and the beauty that we have seen at times, but which really could be through the process and the great event of a revolution and a new society. So what does this quote evoke for you?
Well, it evokes for me possibility right now, going toward the future, to a different future, one without all the horrors of this system. It also takes me back to the beginnings of my getting involved in the struggle, because when I got drafted into the Army, I was not somebody who was, in principle against the war in Vietnam. I saw what was happening to Black people in this country. I didn't like it, but not so much so that I was ready to act on it. But that changed. That changed in a few months there in the late 60s. And it changed because of what was going on in society. And what was going on in society actually was Black people playing a crucial role in helping to bring into being not just resistance to what this system was doing, although it was resistance to what the system was doing, both to Black people, but also around the world, and concentrated in the war in Vietnam, but bringing to the fore in that movement that developed in the 1960s a more radical and even revolutionary thrust. And that was Black people playing a crucial role in putting this thing of the question of human emancipation, even though there wasn't a solid scientific understanding of how to do that and how to carry it forward and how to bring a different world into being, that was leading it. But that question of revolution was getting put on the table, and it was the struggle of Black people that was spearheading that. And the struggle of Black people has historically played that kind of role in this country. And with the leadership that we have today, the revolutionary leadership, it can play that role in terms of the crucial role that he talks about in the quote of leading to the emancipation of all of humanity, not just fighting and beating back a particular injustice or trying to beat back a particular injustice to stop what's happening to Black people, but actually bring forward a movement that is aiming to, acting to, and has the leadership, understanding, and blueprint for the future to achieve the emancipation of humanity.
Okay, so Carl, I think that's a really important point in terms of what impact it has when Black people rise up, and that has to do with the whole history of this country, as we've been talking about. This is a central question, and it's something when I've read this quote. Sometimes we shorthand it as the ugly beauty quote, but when you see the poetry, you feel the poetry of that quote. It does pose to you that the person who came up with this is a poet who understands deeply, as any poet does, their subject matter and their theme. And I think the whole life of Bob Avakian, from when he was a kid in grade school and becoming an athlete and having Black friends, all the way through his work in the early days of the Black Panther Party, this is somebody who has a deep, deep, visceral feeling for the outrages that are visited upon Black people and the potential of Black people to transform not only themselves, but the world and other people. And this is something that just comes through in all of the work and on a theoretical level, but really, as you were saying, in the gut. But I think you are also posing a question that a lot of people have, which is, can white people ever change? It makes sense that you see these incidents. We only recounted 4 or 5 of them, but there have been dozens over the last period of time. Can white people change? Because if they can't, then what does that say about revolution in a country like this? But the fact of the matter is, people can change, and white people can change, and they have changed. You brought out even in more recent struggles that the struggle around Michael Brown and Eric Garner in New York. There was a lot of white youth out in the streets taking over the highways of New York City, and the Revolution Club was out there too. What I want to do is play a clip from Bob Avakian from the speech he gave at the dialogue, Revolution and Religion, a dialogue with Cornel West. And this is a very short clip, it's just a few minutes, but he talks about how in a time of great upsurge, the impact the 1960s, the impact this had on white people.
Now you hear all the time, getting back to white people for a minute, you hear all the time, people can't change, people don't change. How convenient for this system and those who rule over it. Because if people can't change, then nothing can change, and we're stuck with this system that we're forced to live under with all of its horrors. But the fact is, and it's proven all the time, people can and do change. And people who don't have a deep vested interest in an oppressive system can turn against that system and take up something much better. I have seen and been part of times when people, yes, including many white people, especially the youth, became much better. Inspired by black people and others rising up, outraged by the horrific crimes committed by their country and its government, determined to fight for a radically different world. The 1960s, the time when I came forward and became a revolutionary, was such a time when people got much better. To show how much people changed, how radical the times became, how profound the changes were, I like to say that the 60s are a time when even fraternity boys, even white fraternity boys, grew brains. They started looking at the world differently, started thinking about bigger things rather than just how many shots they could down, and how much beer they could guzzle, and how many women they could harass. And it's noteworthy that this was one of the more secular times when people, including myself and many of my friends and the people who politically influenced me the most at the time, the people in the Black Panther Party, were turning away from religion. Why? Because we had hope that changes could be brought about by people struggling in this real world, and it didn't have to wait for some other world to see justice. We felt the reality of being part of a wave of people rising up in all parts of the world, resisting oppression and waging revolution.
Okay, so that was Bob Avakian's talk at the beginning of the dialogue with Cornel West, Revolution and Religion. Hey, and I do want to say to to the people of the current generation who wonder if could we actually unite and what is it possible for this, that it is possible. But it has to do, though, with people acting on what their convictions, and this is particularly true of the youth. And look, the 60s were a different time, but before the 60s, there wasn't the 60s, and nobody thought it could actually happen. But there were stirrings. Look, this is not an accident. I'm wearing this shirt for Stax Bolt, because this was a place where, it's the home of Memphis blues. I had a chance to go there last year, and the heart of this studio, which we don't have time to get into today, was Booker T and the MGs, which was two white dudes, hillbillies, frankly. They were hillbillies, and as self-described, it's not my derogatory comment here, it's how they describe themselves, and two black guys from Memphis, and they all would come together around this record store, and they made some of the most incredible soul music that today still inspires people. Probably know Otis Redding, among others. Bill Withers, who just died, also recorded there. But that's a little bit of a diversion, but it's not a diversion in the sense that this is bone deep. This is bone deep in Bob Avakian. The guy was in a doo-wop book. You see the cover of his memoir. He's there with playing 45s and singing. So and was part of singing groups. So look, we don't have more time to go into this part of this today, but it's very important because it is the science, but that science then undergirds a poetic spirit, and without that poetic spirit, as Bob Avakian has said himself, it would be very dangerous for you to leave a Marxist revolution or a revolution or a socialist state. But I do want to go to one more film clip from Bob Avakian from the dialogue with Cornel West, and this is from the part of this event at Riverside Church several years back, 2015, I believe, when he and Cornel are having a discussion. Now, they go back and forth. You can watch this on the website revcom.us. And here I'm just going to mainly play an answer or part of the conversation where Bob Avakian is talking that gives you a sense of what we could do immediately if we had the power through a revolution and began to implement this. So I want to just play this last film clip of today's program, and that will close us out. So Carl, why don't I, at this point, thank you for being on the show, and you're going to come back, I hope, many times, and just be well.
You invite me, I'll be back.
Okay, well, you're invited. You got a standing invitation such that if you want to be back, you should, at any given time, something you want to talk about, you should give us a shout, and we'll arrange the segment. But we're going to give you a call for sure. So let's just go to that film clip now.
Look, some things can be done right away, just like some things will take a lot longer. As soon as this system is brought down and a new revolutionary system is in place, the police will not go out shooting down the youth in the streets. Right then and there, no more. Now that's a fact. And if somebody is crazed and does do it, they will never be in a position to do it ever again. It will not be this whole process of justifiable homicide. And as I've said before, you will still need forces to protect the security of the people in a new society. Everything is not going to change in one instant. But you can have very different kind of forces protecting the security. Look, quiet as it's kept, we've got security in this room. The church is providing security. Other people are providing security. Is anybody here afraid that they're going to be shot down by the people providing security for this event we're having? I hope not, and I believe not. Why? Because they have a whole different orientation, and they're part of a different process. When you get a whole different system, then as I've said before, if you have there are still going to be people who, have mental problems, go crazy, go off, or so. How do you handle that? Let's say we're the people's police going out, and you run into a situation like that. Our orientation has to be that we would sooner die ourselves than wantonly kill one of the people, even one, or maybe especially one, who's mentally disturbed. That has to be our orientation.
That's right.
If you're part of the people's security, if you're part of the people's security that's there to really serve and protect the people, then you put your life on the line, and if you have to, you lay your life down instead of and before you would ever be thinking of brutalizing any of the people. But that is not going to happen under this system, and that's why we got to get rid of this system, and that's why we have to be very serious about the question of, can we have a revolution? And if we can, how do we make that revolution? We have to, look, this is, it's kind of ironic, but, once again, Clyde Young used to say, one of his favorite sayings was, this is serious as a heart attack. And this is very serious. We need humor. We need play. We need joy. But at the same time, that humor, that play, that joy is all part of something that's very, very serious. It is the lives and the future of the masses of people around the world, which is the most precious thing of all to those of us who want and are fighting for a different world. And so we have to proceed in that kind of a way. And that's why I put the emphasis on being scientific, because being scientific just means understanding and working to understand the world the way it really is. It doesn't mean you'll ever understand everything or everything completely correctly. We're always going to make mistakes and have shortcomings, but we have to really strive to understand the world the way it is. And if we do, then we can see where the possibilities actually lie, not out of wishful thinking, but out of a scientific approach, to know that we actually can have a different kind of world, yes, a different kind of society, and yes, with a different kind of force that really is about protecting and serving the masses of people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So that was from the conversation between Cornel West and Bob Avakian, and he talks at the end of that clip about the necessity for us to be serious and scientific. starting now in building the movement for an actual revolution, through that revolution and in the new society, and how we would actually go about uprooting all forms of oppression. The film, as I said, is on revcom.us. I want to remind you to go back to the clip we played at the beginning and then run all the way through those 5 stops that we were discussing today. And that film is Why We Need an Actual Revolution, How We Could Really Make Revolution. So that's going to conclude our episode today on May 14th, 2020. And I want to encourage everybody to be, if you haven't as yet commented below on the YouTube page, comment now. And even if you want to take an hour or even rewatch this and comment more tomorrow, that's important. We need to hear from you and what you're thinking, what your questions are. Support this show at our Patreon site and become a subscriber to the RevComs channel. We have a goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers. We're close to 600 now, and so we'd like to get this next 400 in the next few weeks, and spread the word of this film through social media to all your friends, people you work with, through your Facebook pages. You can also, while watching the show, Facebook Live this among your friends, and that would actually help spread this to new communities. So with that, for myself, and I'll speak for the other people who work on this show, the crew and the other hosts, wishing you all well, and we'll see you next week for the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show.